All right, so let's get right into it this week. A lot happened while people were probably still finishing up their holiday leftovers.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at the week of December 23rd through the 28th.
Okay.
And to do that, we're going to be using a YouTube series as our source.
Right.
It's called Historia em Gotas.
Okay.
And it's by Professor Around Alves.
Interesting.
So from the war in Ukraine to a pretty controversial gas deal, a plane crash, and even China kind of showing off its military power.
Yeah. Sounds like a busy week.
It was a busy week.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump right in.
Let's start with Ukraine. Professor Alves pointed out that fighting actually continued right through Christmas.
Interesting.
You might think that's a little surprising.
You'd think so.
But it's important to remember that Ukraine and Russia actually celebrate Christmas on different days.
Right.
It's a cultural and political divide that really runs deep.
It shows you how deep those divisions go, that even a holiday like Christmas is affected.
For sure. It adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. But to the fighting itself, Russia actually made some advances in the east.
Okay.
They captured Kislivka after some really intense fighting. And they also made some progress near Kupiansk, Toretsk, and Pokrovsk.
So they're pushing forward.
They are. But on the other hand, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in Zaporizhia Oblast.
Right.
And they actually managed to take back some positions in Pyatikadki.
So it's still that back and forth that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it is a real push and pull.
And of course, we can't forget that Ukrainian airstrike on that Russian military facility.
Oh, yeah, in Kamensk-Shektinsky.
That's the one in Rostov Oblast.
It was a pretty bold move, targeting their production of solid fuel for ballistic missiles.
Yeah. What did you make of that?
Well, it seems like Ukraine's trying to shift their strategy a bit.
How so?
They're not just on the defense anymore. They're going after Russia's ability to wage war in the long run.
Trying to cripple their supply lines, essentially.
It's exactly. But it is risky. Could provoke some pretty serious retaliation.
It could, and we saw a bit of that on Christmas Eve.
Yeah, Russia launched a wave of those missile and drone attacks.
Right. Targeting Ukraine's infrastructure.
Power grids went down, there were casualties, and Zelensky condemned it, calling the attacks inhumane.
It's really a terrible situation for the civilians caught in the middle of this.
It is, and one of those Russian missiles actually flew over Moldovan airspace.
Oh, wow.
Which, of course, led to a strong protest from their president.
So the conflict's spilling over into neighboring countries?
It really shows you how this could escalate beyond Ukraine's borders.
That's a worrying thought.
For sure. And on top of everything else, Ukraine's energy sector is already struggling.
Especially with winter setting in.
Yeah, keeping the lights on is a real challenge right now.
Absolutely. And speaking of energy, let's talk about Zelensky and the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico.
Okay, that gas deal got pretty heated.
It did. Slovakia is really dependent on Russian gas. And Zelensky sees that as a huge security risk, not just for Slovakia, but for Europe as a whole.
He didn't hold back criticizing Fico for that Christmas Eve meeting with Putin in Moscow.
Oh, right.
Even suggested that Fico was siding with Russia and maybe involved in some shady dealings.
He used the phrase obscure schemes.
Yeah, he did.
Wow, Fico defended the meeting, though.
Saying it was about Slovakia's energy security.
Yeah, he said finding other sources of gas would be really hard on the Slovakian economy.
It would be expensive to switch, that's for sure.
Exactly. And it shows the tough spot a lot of European countries are in.
It's a real dilemma, wanting to support Ukraine, but also having to keep their own economies going.
Yeah, and people need to heat their homes, especially in winter.
And then there's that gas transit contract between Ukraine and Russia.
The one that's expiring.
Ukraine's refusing to renew it.
They say the revenue just ends up funding the war.
Which is a valid point.
It is, but it's a gamble for Ukraine, too.
What do you mean?
Well, Russia could retaliate by cutting off gas to other European countries.
The ones that rely on those pipelines through Ukraine.
Yeah, Slovakia, Italy, Austria, the Czech Republic, they'd all be affected.
So this could really shake things up in Europe.
It could. It's a high-stakes game of energy politics.
So where does Putin stand in all of this?
Yeah.
What's his take on the situation?
Well, it's always tough to know exactly what Putin's thinking.
That's true.
But he did give an interview to Pavel Zarubin, a Kremlin journalist.
Okay.
And Putin claims that the West tricked Russia about the Minsk II agreements.
Those were supposed to bring peace to eastern Ukraine back in 2015.
Yeah, he says the West never planned to honor those agreements.
Just using them as a way to buy time to arm Ukraine.
That's his argument.
So he's trying to justify the invasion.
In a way, yes, but he also admitted that Russia could have been better prepared.
Interesting.
And maybe chosen a better time to launch their so-called special military operation.
Sounds like a hint of regret.
Perhaps.
And what about this change in the U.S. administration with Trump coming in?
The Kremlin's been playing it very carefully. They say they're open to dialogue, but they're waiting for the U.S. to make the first move.
So they're not going to be chasing after talks?
Not at all. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said they're open to a ceasefire.
Yeah.
But only if there are legally binding agreements that guarantee Russia's security and their neighbors too.
Okay, so they're setting the bar pretty high for any negotiations.
They are. It remains to be seen if the Trump administration will be willing to meet those demands.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Absolutely. The stakes are very high.
And speaking of high stakes, things have taken a bit of a dark turn with these attacks on military leaders.
You're right. The Russian FSB claims they stopped several attempts by Ukrainian intelligence
to
target high-ranking Russian defense officials and their families.
Were they using traditional espionage methods?
Not according to the FSB. They say Ukrainian agents were planting bombs.
Bombs.
Disguised as everyday objects like power banks and document folders.
That's terrifying and incredibly risky.
It does show a level of desperation or maybe a willingness to escalate beyond conventional warfare.
And this connects to the death of that Russian Lieutenant General Kirillov,
the head of their nuclear, biological, and chemical protection troops.
He was killed by a bomb attached to an electric scooter.
Yeah, a very targeted attack.
And while the SBU, Ukraine's intelligence service, has been linked to it,
they haven't actually claimed responsibility.
It's all very unsettling, especially considering Kirillov's role in nuclear defense.
It does raise concerns about nuclear escalation.
And then there's that warning from Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister.
Right. He warned the incoming Trump administration about the U.S. restarting nuclear weapons testing.
Do you think that's a real possibility?
It's hard to say, but even discussing it is worrisome.
It is Russia. The U.S. and China are all modernizing their nuclear arsenals.
And those old Cold War arms control agreements are falling apart.
So we're inching closer and closer to a very dangerous situation.
It's a precarious moment in history.
It really is.
Yeah.
And while we're focused on the war in Ukraine, China seems to be making some big moves of its own.
They just launched the Swan, their new amphibious assault ship.
I heard about that. It's the biggest one in the world, right?
It is, and it's a big deal because it can act as both a landing ship and an aircraft carrier.
That gives them a serious advantage.
It does, particularly if they decide to make a move on Taiwan.
That's what everyone's thinking, right?
It's certainly the most likely scenario, and it's causing a lot of anxiety for U.S. allies in the region.
And they're not stopping. They're testing new fighter jets, too.
Prototype stealth fighters in Shenyang and Chengdu.
It seems like they're rapidly modernizing their military.
They are, which puts pressure on the U.S., who's having trouble keeping up.
It feels like we're seeing a real shift in the global power balance.
I think you're right.
This is a lot to digest.
It is.
And we haven't even touched on what's happening in Gaza.
Yes. The humanitarian crisis there is truly devastating.
The Israeli airstrike on the Kamal Adwan hospital is just awful.
It was the last major functioning healthcare facility in northern Gaza.
And now?
Now it's essentially inoperable. The World Health Organization called it a death sentence for thousands of Palestinians.
That's heartbreaking. What's the situation like on the ground?
It's dire. Critical departments are damaged, patients and healthcare workers are at risk.
And I imagine getting patients to other facilities is nearly impossible.
It is. They're already overwhelmed.
I'm sure there's a lot of blame being thrown around.
Of course, Israel claims Hamas was using the hospital as a base.
And Hamas denies it.
Yes. It's hard to know what to believe in these situations.
But no matter who's at fault, the impact on civilians is horrific.
It is. The WHO has verified over 516 attacks on healthcare facilities in Gaza.
During this conflict?
Yes, and a staggering 90% of medical units have been damaged or destroyed.
That's hard to even comprehend.
It's a humanitarian catastrophe. Over 45,000 people reported dead, and most of the population displaced.
The international community needs to step up and help.
Absolutely. It's a desperate situation.
Well, we've covered a lot here, from war and diplomacy to humanitarian crises.
We have. It's been a heavy but important conversation.
It has, and while we focused on the major events, there were some smaller incidents worth mentioning.
Right. There's always more to the story.
So what else happened during this eventful week?
Well, there was that plane crash in Kazakhstan.
Okay.
A flight from Baku, Azerbaijan to Grozny, Chechnya.
Yeah.
At first, they blamed Ukrainian drones, but later investigations pointed to Russian air defenses accidentally shooting it down.
Wow, a terrible mistake.
Yes, Putin apologized to the Azerbaijani president, and there's a criminal investigation ongoing.
It really highlights the risk of unintended consequences in a conflict zone.
Even far from the front lines.
Absolutely. And then there was that mass prison break in Mozambique.
In Maputo on Christmas Day, no less.
At least 6,000 inmates escaped.
It happened during riots and violence after a disputed election.
6,000 inmates. That's incredible. What triggered it?
It seems to be rooted in political instability. The disputed election really fueled unrest and distrust in the government.
So it's more than just a security failure. It's a sign of deeper problems.
Exactly. It shows how fragile things are in a country dealing with political divisions.
And speaking of security concerns, there's that CNN report about Russia producing Shahed drones.
Right. Those drones have become a real symbol of this conflict.
And now they're making them domestically.
It's a way for them to be less reliant on Iran.
And to get around those sanctions.
That's exactly.
Do we know how successful they've been?
Well, Ukrainian intelligence says they produced over 5,760 drones this year at a factory in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone.
That's more than double what they made last year.
It is, and satellite images confirm that the factory is expanding.
So they're adapting and overcoming the challenges they're facing.
They are.
And this has implications for Ukraine.
Of course, it gives Russia a major advantage in reconnaissance, targeting even direct attacks.
And Ukraine knows this. They recently hit a meeting of Russian commanders with a HIMARS strike.
Right, in Zaporizhia Oblast.
They lured the commanders into a trap disguised as a humanitarian operation.
Very clever tactics.
And effective.
Reports say at least 3 Russian officers were killed, including a battalion commander.
It's a blow to the Russian military.
It is, but this conflict is far from over too. Both sides are constantly angsting and finding new ways to fight.
It's a complex and ever-changing situation.
It is, and it's important to understand the nuances of what's happening.
I'm sure our listeners are trying to keep up with it all.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to understand these events and how they affect the world.
I agree.
So let's try to break it down and highlight some of the key takeaways from this week.
All right, sounds good.
First, the war in Ukraine is clearly not ending anytime soon.
It's dragging on.
We've seen Russia make some progress, but they're also facing setbacks.
It's a stalemate in many ways.
And the effects are being felt far beyond Ukraine's borders.
Like with that gas deal between Slovakia and Russia.
Which raises questions about European energy security.
Right. It's a difficult balancing act for many countries.
Yes, they want to support Ukraine, but they also have to look after their own interests.
Exactly.
And we can't forget those attacks on military leaders, adding another layer of risk to the conflict.
It's a dangerous trend.
Then there's China flexing its muscles with that huge new warship and their advanced fighter jets.
They're definitely sending a message to the world.
And it's making the U.S. and its allies nervous.
It's a shift in the balance of power.
And of course, there's the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
The situation is simply heartbreaking.
The attack on that hospital just makes a terrible situation even worse.
It's a plea for the international community to do more.
And we talked about some of the smaller incidents too, like the plane crash in Kazakhstan and the prison break in Mozambique.
They remind us that even seemingly isolated events can have global repercussions.
It's a complicated world.
It is.
And we also can't overlook Russia's efforts to build those Shahed drones themselves.
They're determined to keep fighting.
And it shows they can adapt to challenges. So we've got war diplomacy, humanitarian crises. It's been a pretty heavy week.
It has, but it's important to be aware of these things.
And to understand how they're all connected.
Exactly.
So as we move into the new year and the new administration,
with Trump taking office,
it's worth asking ourselves how these events might shape U.S. foreign policy.
Especially when it comes to Ukraine and Russia.
Trump wants to broker peace, but he's also praised Putin.
It'll be a tricky situation to navigate.
It will. And then there's China's growing influence, too.
The U.S. can't ignore that.
It's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. We're entering a new era.
So to our listeners, keep that question in mind as you follow these developments.
It's something to think about.
How will the Trump administration handle this complex geopolitical landscape?
It's a big question.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a truly eventful week.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with more analysis of current events.
We will.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed.
And stay engaged.
Exactly. It really is. Okay, so we've gone through this whirlwind, and I'm guessing our listeners are probably looking for some key takeaways.
Yeah, let's distill it down to what really matters.
But what are the big things people should remember from this week?
Well, first and foremost, the conflict in Ukraine is not going away anytime soon.
Nope.
We saw Russia make some gains, but they also had some setbacks, too.
It's a reminder that this isn't a simple one-sided war.
Exactly. It's a lot more complex than that, and the effects of this war are being felt way beyond Ukraine's borders.
Yeah, like with that gas deal between Slovakia and Russia.
Right. That situation really highlights how crucial European energy security is as a whole.
And how tough it is for some countries to balance their support for Ukraine with their own needs.
Exactly. They're trying to walk a tightrope.
They are. And we can't forget those attacks on military leaders on both sides.
It adds another layer of danger and complexity to this conflict.
It really does. And meanwhile, China's out there making some pretty bold moves.
Oh yeah, with that massive new warship and those advanced fighter jets, they're clearly trying to project power.
They're not hiding their ambitions anymore.
Nope, and that's causing some serious concern for the U.S. and their allies.
Especially in the Indo-Pacific region.
It's definitely shifting the balance of power, and then there's the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
The situation there is just heartbreaking.
It really is. That attack on the Kamal Adwan hospital was devastating.
It just makes a terrible situation even worse.
And it underscores how important it is for the international community to step up and provide aid.
It's a call to action for sure.
It is. We also talked about some smaller but still significant events like the plane crash in Kazakhstan.
Right, and that prison break in Mozambique.
Those incidents remind us that even things that seem isolated can actually have global consequences.
Everything's connected.
Exactly. It's a complex web.
And we can't forget Russia's push to build those Shahed drones domestically.
It's a sign that they're not backing down from this fight.
And that they can adapt and innovate even with those sanctions in place.
Absolutely. So we've got war, we've got diplomacy, we've got humanitarian crises.
It's been a heavy week.
It has, but it's vital to stay informed and aware of what's happening in the world.
And now, with a new year upon us and a new administration in the U.S.,
with Trump taking over,
it begs the question, how will these events shape U.S. foreign policy going forward?
That's the big question, isn't it? Particularly when it comes to Ukraine and Russia.
Trump's said he wants peace, but he's also spoken pretty favorably about Putin.
It'll be a delicate balancing act, for sure.
And then you've got China's growing influence to consider as well.
The U.S. can't just ignore that.
It's going to be fascinating to see how this all unfolds.
It's a new era in global politics.
So to our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep this question in mind as you follow these developments.
How will the Trump administration navigate this complex geopolitical landscape?
It's something to ponder as we enter a new year full of challenges and opportunities.
We'll be here to break it all down for you, of course.
That's right. We'll be here to help you make sense of it all. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a truly eventful week.
It's been my pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with more analysis of current events. Until then, stay curious.
Stay engaged.
It is, and it's really about connecting the dots, isn't it?
Exactly, seeing those patterns, and sometimes you find some pretty surprising things when you start connecting things.
For sure. For example, we talked about China's military getting stronger and their ambitions in the Indo-Pacific.
Right, and how they want to be the dominant force in that region.
Exactly. But we also talked about Russia struggling to keep up with their military supplies, especially with all those sanctions.
You're thinking about those Shahed drones again, right?
Yeah, and how they're trying to build more of them themselves.
Well, here's a thought. What if Russia turns to China for help?
Interesting. China's been trying to stay neutral in this whole Ukraine conflict.
They have, but they've also been getting closer to Russia.
It's true. So you're thinking if Russia runs low on key military equipment,
they might ask China to step in and help them out, maybe secretly.
That would be a risky move for China, though.
They could face backlash from the West, even more sanctions.
But if they see it as a way to advance their own interests,
they might decide it's worth the risk.
And what if China actually becomes a major supplier of weapons to Russia?
It could really change the balance of power in the region, maybe even drag the war in Ukraine on even longer.
It's a scenario we have to consider.
We do. It shows how events that seem unrelated can have some pretty big consequences.
That's what makes geopolitics so fascinating and a little bit scary at the same time.
You never know what's going to happen next.
It's like a giant game of chess with incredibly high stakes.
Exactly, which is why it's crucial to stay informed, to keep asking questions and be open to different perspectives.
Well said. That's what we try to do on this show, to look at things from different angles and help our listeners understand the complexities of the world.
And hopefully spark some interesting conversations along the way.
Absolutely. So we hope you've learned something new today and that you're leaving this deep dive with a better understanding of what happened this past week.
And maybe a few new questions to think about.
Always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more analysis of current events.
Until then, stay curious.
And stay engaged.